The Mitchells were the epitome of suburban success. Their charming two-story house sat on a quiet street in the picturesque town of Lakewood, Florida. From the outside, everything about them seemed idyllic: neatly trimmed hedges, a well-manicured lawn, and children who waved cheerfully to neighbors as they left for school. Yet behind the facade of their perfect life lay a simmering discontent that only a few could see. Rachel Mitchell was a 35-year-old stay-at-home mother, her life revolving around her family and their home. She had dedicated herself to raising her two children, Lily, age 8, and Sam, age 5. Rachel's days were filled with the mundane routine of cooking, cleaning, and shuttling her kids to school and extracurricular activities. Despite her outward contentment and tireless devotion, she felt increasingly isolated and unfulfilled. Her dreams of a vibrant career had been sacrificed for the stability of family life, and the monotony of her days began to weigh heavily on her spirit. Mark Mitchell, Rachel's 37-year-old husband, was a successful financial advisor. His career was the envy of many, marked by steady promotions and a generous salary. Mark was known in the community as a diligent and reliable professional, but his commitment to work had begun to create a gulf between him and his family. Long hours and frequent business trips had taken their toll, and his interactions with Rachel had become marked by an increasing emotional distance. What was once a relationship of shared dreams and aspirations had devolved into routine and unspoken frustration. Emily Thompson, the Mitchells' new babysitter, was a 19-year-old high school graduate with big dreams. She had recently moved from a small, insular town in Georgia to Lakewood, seeking opportunities and a fresh start. Emily's intelligence and ambition were evident, but so was her vulnerability. Her transition to a new city and her reliance on a part-time babysitting job left her feeling disconnected and alone. She had hoped that working for the Mitchells would provide her with a sense of belonging and a foothold in her new environment. The Mitchells had hired Emily just a few months earlier when their previous babysitter had left for college. At first, Emily's presence seemed like a breath of fresh air. Her youthful energy and enthusiasm were a stark contrast to Rachel's weary demeanor. Emily quickly bonded with Lily and Sam, making her way into the family's daily life with ease. Her friendliness and genuine affection for the children made her an immediate hit, and her presence was a welcome change for Rachel, who was beginning to feel increasingly overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood and her stagnant life. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent harmony, cracks were starting to show. Rachel's life was consumed by the endless cycle of household duties and family obligations. Though she often smiled and chatted with neighbors, her eyes betrayed a deeper dissatisfaction. Mark's long hours at work and growing disinterest in their relationship left Rachel feeling neglected and isolated. Their once passionate connection had been replaced by routine arguments and unspoken resentments. The catalyst that disrupted this fragile equilibrium came in the form of Emily's arrival. While Emily was initially seen as a savior, her presence soon began to subtly alter the dynamics within the Mitchell household. Her youthful charm and attentive nature seemed to draw Mark's attention in ways Rachel had not anticipated. Mark, who had been distant and preoccupied, found himself engaging more with Emily. Their conversations, though innocent at first, began to carry an undertone of flirtation. Rachel noticed the change in Mark's behavior but struggled to pinpoint the cause. He was more relaxed around Emily and seemed to find in her a refuge from the pressures of work and home life. Emily's admiration for Mark was evident, though she made a concerted effort to mask her feelings behind a veneer of professionalism. However, her growing infatuation with Mark was hard to ignore. The subtle glances, the way she lingered during conversations, and the small gestures of attention all hinted at an underlying tension that Rachel could not ignore. As weeks passed, Rachel's unease grew. She began to question the nature of Emily's interactions with Mark, though she lacked concrete evidence of any wrongdoing. Her suspicions were compounded by Mark's increasing absences from home and the way he seemed to come alive when Emily was around. Rachel's attempts to confront Mark about her feelings were met with dismissal. He attributed her concerns to stress and reassured her that there was nothing inappropriate happening. The situation reached a tipping point when Rachel discovered that Emily had been spending more time with Mark than she had realized. It started with little things: Mark mentioning a conversation with Emily or Rachel seeing them together more frequently in the house. These seemingly innocent moments began to accumulate, and Rachel's growing paranoia led her to question every interaction between her husband and the babysitter. One evening, Rachel observed Emily and Mark talking in the living room. their conversation more animated than usual. The way Mark looked at Emily and the way she responded with laughter and flirtation were hard to ignore. Rachel's heart pounded as she watched from the doorway, a mix of anger and fear swelling within her. She knew that something was wrong, but she could not yet pinpoint the exact nature of the issue. Emily's arrival had stirred up a storm in the Mitchells' lives. What began as a seemingly simple change, a new babysitter in the household, had slowly unraveled the threads of the Mitchells' seemingly perfect life. As Rachel's suspicions grew, the once peaceful home was now a battleground of unspoken tensions and hidden desires. The cracks in their perfect facade were widening, and the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation that would change their lives forever. With the new dynamic in play and the underlying issues coming to the fore, the Mitchell family's carefully constructed world was on the brink of collapse. The introduction of Emily had disrupted the balance, revealing hidden fractures and sparking a chain of events that would soon explode into a crisis of epic proportions. The weeks following Emily's arrival had transformed the Mitchell household from a place of comfortable routine into a cauldron of unspoken tension. While the family's exterior remained unchanged, the undercurrents of jealousy and suspicion were beginning to simmer and bubble to the surface. Rachel Mitchell's unease had only deepened. The subtle signs of Mark's growing affection for Emily were becoming increasingly apparent. Mark, who had always been reserved and distant, now seemed more alive and engaged, especially when Emily was around. His demeanor shifted noticeably after their interactions, as if the brief encounters with Emily had reawakened something in him. Rachel's attempts to engage Mark in meaningful conversation about their relationship were met with dismissive responses. He brushed off her concerns with a combination of irritation and confusion, claiming she was simply stressed and overreacting. Emily, for her part, continued to maintain a facade of professionalism. However, her growing infatuation with Mark was impossible to completely conceal. She found herself drawn to him in ways that went beyond mere admiration. The way she lingered during their conversations, the subtle flirtations, and the way she would occasionally touch his arm or laugh a little too hard at his jokes were small but telling signs. Emily's feelings for Mark were becoming increasingly obsessive. She began to fantasize about a future with him, imagining a life where they could be together without the constraints of their current realities. Rachel's paranoia reached new heights as she started to actively monitor Emily's and Mark's interactions. She began to find excuses to stay home from her social engagements, ensuring she was present during the times Emily was babysitting. Rachel's vigilance became obsessive. She scrutinized every exchange between Mark and Emily, looking for any sign of inappropriate behavior. Her anxiety over Mark's fidelity began to dominate her thoughts, leading her to question even the smallest details of their daily life. One afternoon, Rachel decided to confront Mark directly. She had noticed that Emily seemed to be spending more time in Mark's home office, ostensibly helping him with some paperwork. Rachel's patience was wearing thin, and she demanded an explanation for why Emily needed to be alone with Mark so frequently. Mark, caught off guard by the accusation, grew defensive. He insisted that Emily was simply being helpful, and that Rachel was reading too much into things. His anger only fueled Rachel's paranoia, making her more convinced that something was amiss. Rachel's growing obsession with the situation led her to follow Emily one evening. She had noticed that Emily was taking longer to leave the house than usual. Rachel, driven by an overwhelming sense of dread, trailed Emily discreetly. To her horror, Rachel discovered Emily and Mark having a seemingly innocent conversation in a local park. Mark was laughing and seemingly relaxed, while Emily's body language was suggestive of an emotional intimacy that Rachel had feared. It was not the meeting itself that was most troubling, but rather the ease with which Emily and Mark interacted. The way Emily's eyes lingered on Mark and the way Mark responded to her were deeply unsettling for Rachel. Rachel's discovery led her to an emotional breakdown. She confronted Mark once again, but this time with more force. Mark's patience was wearing thin, and he accused Rachel of being irrational and untrusting. Their argument was heated, and Mark's frustration only deepened Rachel's sense of betrayal. Rachel felt isolated and unsupported, believing that Mark was deliberately ignoring the signs of Emily's infatuation. Emily, aware of Rachel's growing hostility, became increasingly paranoid. She feared being discovered and losing her job. The more Rachel scrutinized her actions, the more Emily felt trapped. Her obsession with Mark turned into a dangerous fixation. She began to justify her behavior by convincing herself that Mark was unhappy with Rachel and that she was simply providing him with the emotional support he needed. One evening, as Rachel was out with friends, an increasingly rare occurrence due to her mounting suspicions, Emily took advantage of the opportunity to spend extra time with Mark. The two of them were alone in the house and the tension was palpable. Emily, trying to maintain her composure, found it increasingly difficult to hide her feelings. Mark, while not reciprocating Emily's advances directly, seemed to enjoy the attention and the emotional connection that Emily provided. Rachel, meanwhile, decided to stay home unexpectedly. She had become so consumed by her paranoia that she was willing to sacrifice her social life to catch Mark and Emily in the act. As she pulled into the driveway, her heart raced with a mixture of hope and dread. She approached the house quietly, her mind racing with scenarios of what she might find. As Rachel entered the house, she was met with a scene that both confirmed and complicated her fears. Mark and Emily were sitting together on the couch, deep in conversation. They looked up in surprise as Rachel walked in. The tension in the room was palpable. Emily's face flushed with guilt, while Mark's expression was a mix of annoyance and confusion. Rachel's abrupt entrance had caught them off guard, and for a moment the atmosphere was charged with unspoken words. Rachel's confrontation with Mark and Emily was emotional and raw. She demanded an explanation, and Mark, caught between anger and frustration, tried to dismiss Rachel's claims. Emily, her face pale and her voice trembling, struggled to maintain her composure. The argument that followed was intense, with accusations flying and emotions running high. Emily excused herself, claiming she needed to go home, leaving Mark and Rachel alone to continue their argument. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the Mitchell household was fraught with tension. Rachel's paranoia deepened, and Mark's frustration grew. Emily, feeling the heat of the situation, began to withdraw, both emotionally and physically. The once vibrant interactions between her and Mark became strained and awkward. Rachel, convinced that Emily was a threat to her marriage, began to devise a plan to uncover the full extent of the affair, if there was one. The dynamics within the Mitchell family were now in turmoil. Rachel's increasing jealousy and Emily's desperate fixation on Mark had created a dangerous and volatile situation. The walls of the Mitchell home, once a sanctuary, now seemed to close in with every passing day. The conflict between Rachel and Emily was escalating, setting the stage for a dramatic and explosive confrontation that would ultimately unravel the fragile fabric of their lives. As the days went by, the tension continued to build. The seemingly benign interactions between Mark and Emily became the focal point of Rachel's obsessive scrutiny. The once peaceful home was now a battleground of suspicion and paranoia. The stage was set for a dramatic clash that would have far-reaching and devastating consequences. The Mitchell household was teetering on the brink of collapse. The tension between Rachel, Mark, and Emily had reached a boiling point. Each interaction was fraught with suspicion and hidden motives, and the air was thick with unspoken accusations and resentments. One evening, the situation reached its breaking point. Rachel had returned home early from a charity event, driven by an overwhelming sense of dread. She had grown increasingly convinced that Emily and Mark were engaged in a secret relationship, and her paranoia had reached its peak. The night was humid and oppressive, reflecting the tumultuous emotions within the house. Rachel had spent the afternoon meticulously planning how she would confront Mark and Emily. Her emotions were a turbulent mix of anger, desperation, and fear. She knew that she needed to confront them together to uncover the truth once and for all. She had not informed Mark of her early return, hoping to catch him off guard. As Rachel entered the house, she was struck by an eerie silence. The kids were staying overnight at their grandparents' house, leaving Rachel alone with Mark and Emily. She moved quietly through the hallway, her heart pounding with anticipation. The house felt different, more intimate and suffocating without the usual bustle of family life. Rachel's suspicion was soon confirmed when she heard raised voices coming from the living room. Mark and Emily were engaged in a heated conversation. Rachel's grip tightened on the doorframe as she listened, her breath catching in her throat. The words she overheard were a mix of anger and emotional desperation. Unable to contain herself any longer, Rachel burst into the living room. Mark and Emily looked up in shock. Mark's expression shifted from surprise to irritation, while Emily's face turned ashen. The confrontation was immediate and explosive. Rachel's voice trembled with a mixture of fury and hurt as she accused Emily of seducing her husband and destroying her family. Mark tried to calm Rachel, his voice tense but controlled. He insisted that there was nothing going on between him and Emily, that Rachel's paranoia was clouding her judgment. Emily, caught in the middle, struggled to maintain her composure. Her guilt and fear were evident, but she tried to defend herself, claiming that her feelings for Mark were unreciprocated and that she had never intended to cause any harm. The argument quickly escalated. Rachel, overwhelmed by a surge of emotion, accused Mark of lying to her and betraying their marriage. She hurled accusations at Emily, calling her a homewrecker and a seductress. Emily's attempts to explain were drowned out by Rachel's loud and relentless outbursts. In the heat of the moment, Rachel's anger and desperation reached a boiling point. She had been holding on to her emotions for too long, and the confrontation acted as a catalyst for a sudden and irrational act of violence. As Rachel continued to berate Emily, she picked up a nearby vase and, in a fit of rage, hurled it at Emily. The vase struck Emily with a sickening thud. Emily stumbled backward, crashing into a nearby coffee table. The force of the impact caused Emily to fall and hit her head on the sharp edge of the table. She lay motionless on the floor, her face pale and her breathing shallow. The room fell into a stunned silence. Rachel's immediate reaction was one of shock and disbelief. She had not intended to cause serious harm, let alone kill Emily. The realization of what she had done hit her like a tidal wave. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she looked at Emily's lifeless form. Panic surged through Rachel, and she began to cry, her sobs echoing through the empty house. Mark, who had been frozen in shock, finally snapped out of his daze. He rushed to Emily's side, but it was too late. Rachel's act of violence had proven fatal. Mark's eyes were filled with a mixture of horror and rage as he turned to Rachel. His anger quickly shifted from Emily to Rachel, and he demanded to know what had driven her to such a violent act. In a state of panic, Rachel tried to clean up the scene. She knew that the implications of Emily's death would be disastrous for her and her family. She grabbed a cloth and began to wipe away the bloodstains, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Mark, still in shock, was unable to offer much help. His focus was on trying to process the reality of what had just happened. Realizing that she needed to act quickly, Rachel decided to flee the scene. She told Mark that she was going to call the police and fled the house, leaving Mark alone with Emily's body. Rachel drove aimlessly, her mind racing with thoughts of how to escape the consequences of her actions. She eventually parked her car in a secluded area and tried to calm down, her hands still trembling. The next morning, the police arrived at the Mitchells' home in response to a call about an abandoned vehicle. They found Mark in a state of shock, sitting beside Emily's body. The investigation quickly revealed the circumstances surrounding Emily's death. Mark's statements to the police were disjointed and emotional, reflecting the trauma of the night's events. As the police conducted their investigation, Rachel's sudden disappearance became a significant concern. Authorities launched a search for her, and her whereabouts quickly became a subject of media interest. Rachel, who had been hiding in a rundown motel, was eventually tracked down and arrested. Her attempts to avoid capture were in vain, and she was brought back to face the consequences of her actions. The trial that followed was a media sensation. The details of the confrontation between Rachel, Mark, and Emily were laid bare, and the public was captivated by the tragic and dramatic events. Rachel's defense argued that her actions had been the result of overwhelming emotional stress and an uncharacteristic outburst of violence. They painted a picture of a woman pushed to the brink by her husband's betrayal and her own mounting fears. The prosecution, on the other hand, presented a stark portrayal of Rachel's actions as a deliberate and reckless act of violence. The evidence against Rachel was damning: the bloody scene, her erratic behavior, and the testimony from Mark, who described the heated argument that led to Emily's death.